Frank Cascio, a close confidant who watched Michael Jackson up close, says Michael never explicitly spoke these words. Yet, as Frank told me, truth has a way of slipping through silence. Through that dazzling career, under blinding spotlights and constant scrutiny, Michael nurtured 5 connections with fellow artists, guarded like state secrets. No fanfare, no public declarations. But each name, Frank suggests, makes the pop world hold its breath. Freddie Mercury, the mirror, he says, who seemed to reflect Michael's soul. Luther Vandross, the presence Frank recalls as bringing a rare calm to Michael's heart. And the other 3? Strange, splendid, unexpected. Perhaps you know them. Perhaps you have played their music many times, never realizing they once carried a fragment of him. Before we follow Frank into these whispered connections, remember to like, comment, and subscribe, so you do not miss the revelations that might make your heart tremble. In a long conversation with me, Frank Cascio emphasized that no one should ever assume Michael Jackson was always closed off, shy, forever trapped in inescapable shadows. He said there were moments, rare and fleeting, when Michael, too, hurled himself into the flame like a moth in places where there were no screams of fans, no crushing expectations. Only himself and another man, the one nightlife circles once whispered about as the uncrowned queen of disco, Sylvester. Frank repeated the full name, Sylvester James, Jr., a name that, once spoken, seems to bring San Francisco's nightlife back to life. With wild hair, glittering metallic dresses, and a falsetto voice that could pierce any boundary, Sylvester was more than just a singer. He was an icon, a declaration of defiance, the most vivid embodiment of a generation of LGBTQ+ artists who dared step onto the stage without asking permission from anyone. While America remained tangled in prejudice and moral hypocrisy, Sylvester had only one statement, which Frank recalled hearing: "I'm going to be who I am, whether they like it or not." And it was precisely that, according to Frank, that drew Michael in. Frank looked back on the off-the-wall era, when Michael was beginning to blossom out of the shadow of the Jackson 5, living for the first time as an independent artist, and said that was when he brushed up against the dazzling world of disco, music not only to be heard, but to be freed by. In his search for material for his first album with Quincy Jones, Michael began frequenting underground clubs, where there were no screaming fans, only souls dancing in the midst of sweat, bass, and spinning lights. During one visit to Club Trocadero Transfer, a famous gathering spot for artists in San Francisco, Frank recounted what a few veteran DJs told him, that Michael and Sylvester had a fated encounter. No grand event, no cameras, just 2 people in a dark corner, looking at each other in silence, then stepping onto the dance floor together like 2 facing mirrors. At the time, Michael was dressed surprisingly simply, a white shirt, plain jeans, but his gaze was drawn to the way Sylvester laughed loudly, completely unafraid of judgment. A choreographer who had worked on the Jacksons' Destiny tour, with whom Frank later spoke, put it this way: "Sylvester was wild. He didn't care who saw what. But around Michael, he was quiet, almost reverent. And Michael, he looked at him like watching fire. Curious, scared, and desperate to touch it." After that meeting, Frank remembered the whispers within the crew, that Michael secretly visited San Francisco more often, that he had dedicated a private room in a long-term rented villa in Pacific Heights, a space only a small circle of trusted people could enter. And among them, according to a backstage assistant whose story Frank heard, Sylvester was a regular guest. There were no clear photographs, no recordings, only scattered fragments from those who had once worked in that villa, from the housekeeper to the chauffeur. Yet all told the same kind of story. They had nights when the music never stopped, and then mornings when the silence felt heavier than it should have. No one knows exactly what existed between them: friendship, curiosity, or an unnamed feeling between 2 souls that never quite belonged to the ordinary world. But there was one haunting detail Frank brought up. In an unreleased draft of one of Michael's songs, there was a handwritten note beside the title, Private Star. He made me feel like I could wear colors. Just once. For someone like Michael, whose entire life had been framed by norms, prejudice, and especially the burden of having to be a role model as a world-famous black artist, Sylvester represented something on the opposite shore. A man who dared to stand up, dared to stand out, dared to live honestly, dared to be different without apologizing to anyone. Michael, despite being the king of the stage, had never truly lived that way. At that point, Frank paused for quite a while, as if to say that it was this very contrast that made their story shimmer, and then vanish, like fireworks in a sky full of smoke. Someone in the industry once told Frank that Michael had invited Sylvester to record a short segment in an untitled demo, featuring only piano and falsetto harmonies. But that demo was never released, and after Sylvester left the stage for good, it, too, disappeared into Michael's private archives, never to be heard again. Years later, a music archivist who took part in the auction of Michael Jackson's personal items told Frank that in an old leather notebook there was a line written in black ink, messy and faded, as if penned in the middle of the night. "I didn't know how to dance like him, but I knew how to watch him. And that feeling? It was like dancing on the inside." No one has confirmed that those words were meant for Sylvester. But anyone who had ever heard even a faint echo of that connection through those broken bits of storytelling felt it clearly. It was not just a meeting. It was a silent storm passing through a man's heart, leaving behind the smell of rain. The bond between Michael and Sylvester was never made public. Perhaps out of fear, perhaps to protect each other, or simply because at that time the two of them were not allowed to stand side by side in the way they might have wanted. One lived by following public standards, the other by smashing every mold. They were two opposite poles of the same battle, the fight to be themselves. Frank said that someone once told him, Michael didn't just hide from the world, he hid from the people who reflected the part of him he wasn't ready to face. And if that is true, then in the story Frank shared, Sylvester was probably the first, and perhaps the only mirror that made Michael realize one thing. The stage lights were never the brightest place. It was in the dark corners beside someone who dared to live authentically that his heart beat the loudest. Frank Cascio told me that no mirror can fully reflect a person's soul, especially when both sides are so skilled at hiding the broken pieces inside themselves. Michael Jackson, a name that transcended the boundaries of race, stage, and prejudice. Freddie Mercury, the living embodiment of defiance and exuberance, yet carrying a heart far lonelier than one would imagine in a world full of applause, but lacking genuine embraces. Two men who seemed to stand at opposite ends of the universe, and yet, from what Frank had heard and partially witnessed, people still whispered that they had touched each other, not through the glittering stage lights, but through the gaze of those who had been isolated by the very world they conquered. In the early 1980s, Michael had only just broken out of his golden boy Motown image, trying to find his own voice in a rapidly changing pop landscape. Freddie, then the soul of Queen, was gradually losing himself among shattered relationships and a life he once described as free but lost. According to what Frank heard from industry insiders, they met in a recording studio in Los Angeles, and for a veteran studio engineer who worked there at the time, it was not exactly their first encounter, but it was the first time they truly saw each other, not as stars, but as human beings. Michael looked at Freddie as if he were trying to read what Freddie wasn't saying. Freddie was oddly quiet. No jokes, no playful banter as usual. Frank quoted, "There must be more to life than this," the song they recorded together, but that was not properly released at the time, became a silent symbol of their connection in the eyes of those who were watching from the sidelines. The unfinished demo tapes, their voices blending into one another to the point where it was hard to tell who was following whom. And in those moments, rumors began to surface, that there was something beyond friendship, beyond music. Frank recounted that a close friend of Freddie once confided to him, "Freddie didn't say it outright, but with that look, you know the one." It was as if there was something unnamed between them, a kind of recognition, like two kings realizing they both wear invisible crowns. But whatever feeling might have existed was trapped between two worlds they could not escape. Michael was retreating further and further into himself, partly because of his immense fame, partly because the shadow of his skin color and background made him feel like someone merely allowed to be there, never truly belonging. Whispers, sometimes mocking, sometimes crude, about who he was, his style, even how he smiled, how he dressed, followed every public appearance. In a society not yet ready to accept an artist of color with such a fragile and sensitive inner life, for Michael to fully face himself was almost impossible. Freddie, with the boldness of a man who had openly lived through many same-gender relationships, remained a symbol of daring to be oneself. Yet, as Frank emphasized, he never publicly spoke about whatever might have existed between him and Michael. Even later, when asked about the unfinished recordings, Freddie merely gave a soft smile. "Some things are better left in silence. Some people say that their relationship, whatever it was, cracked under the weight of their vast differences. Michael valued cleanliness, perfectionism, and lived almost like a recluse. Freddie lived fast, intensely, burning bright. Rumor has it that Freddie once stormed out of a recording session in anger because Michael kept complaining about his pet chimpanzee in the studio. It sounds amusing, but at its core, it was also a kind of defense mechanism from someone constantly afraid of being hurt. And Freddie, who was also deeply sensitive, was not the kind of person who could stand endlessly outside the door waiting for someone to step out from behind such a thick mask. Yet behind all those layers of defense, everyone has a fragile part that only a kindred spirit can see. Once, in a private conversation with a biographer, a dancer who had performed with Michael recounted, and Frank later had the chance to read this note. "There were nights in the hotel when Michael sat still for hours without speaking. Once he said, 'Freddie's voice felt like my thoughts, raw, chaotic, but beautiful.' It was not possessive love, but a kind of emotion that makes a person feel a little less lost in this world." The unfinished recordings were later released by Queen as a tribute, but no one ever truly explained why the two did not continue working together. Perhaps because they saw too much of themselves in each other's eyes, and that vision frightened them. When you see yourself too clearly in another person, you do not know whether to move closer or run away. Michael never spoke about Freddie in personal terms during interviews, but in an internal memo made public many years later, related to selecting songs for a private performance, he underlined a Queen track and wrote beside it, "He knew the ache I carry." Just one line, yet enough to understand that sometimes the deepest things are those we neither need nor are able to say out loud. And perhaps that was the only thing Michael Jackson and Freddie Mercury truly shared, a truth that was never allowed to exist in the light, but that continued to burn faintly, like an unnamed flame, somewhere between two souls that once illuminated the entire world.
Frank Cascio told me that no one could have imagined two people like them ever really colliding. Michael Jackson, a global superstar, living in a world of stage lights, millions of fans, and endless questions about his appearance, his fame, his difference. Jean-Michel Basquiat, wild, chaotic, emerging from the streets of Brooklyn, spraying his personal obsessions onto walls, and then losing himself in New York's high art circles. One was music, the other was painting. One was withdrawn, the other seemed to operate purely on instinct and passion. But sometimes it is precisely these out-of-place souls who recognize each other in a room no one else notices. The story, according to what Frank pieced together from members of Michael's creative circle, began around 1984, when Michael was at his peak with Thriller, and Basquiat was seen as the wild child of contemporary art, not fully embraced, yet impossible to ignore. An old friend of Michael's, then working on his creative team in Los Angeles, told Frank that Andy Warhol was the first to bring up Basquiat's name in front of Michael. Mike stared at Basquiat's paintings for a long time in silence, then asked just one question. This person, what is he afraid of? It was no coincidence that Michael was drawn into that world. Both of them, as Frank observed, were symbols of a strange kind of loneliness. Not abandoned, not forgotten, but lonely in the very center of everyone's gaze. Basquiat once said, "I'm not a real person, I'm a legend someone made up." Michael didn't have to say anything. People saw the same thing in his eyes every time he stepped off stage, a look that hovered, never truly landing anywhere. There was a time when Michael appeared unexpectedly at a Basquiat exhibition in Soho. No fans, no bodyguards, no cameras. Just one man standing amid explosive, color-soaked canvases, staring at a pitch-black painting with a scrawled line, "I do not belong here." A gallery employee later told Frank that Michael stood there for more than half an hour, saying nothing, just lightly touching the edge of the frame as if tracing an invisible crack. After the exhibition, according to people in the scene whom Frank later spoke with, the two were seen leaving the gallery together, getting into a black limo, and driving around Manhattan all night. No one knew where they went. Only a few whispered rumors passed through the art world that Michael and Jean-Michel had private nights where there was no music, no paintings, just two men talking about things no one else could quite understand. The fear of being watched every second, and the unease of being endlessly misunderstood. A visual artist who had been close to Basquiat told Frank, "Jean used to get high on other people's sadness, but when he talked about Michael, he said, 'He's like watching your own reflection cry.'" A sad, beautiful, and deeply haunting line, just like the way their connection brushed past each other's lives. At that time, Michael avoided the press at all costs, and even more so, kept any private relationships far from public view. Yet those working close to him sensed a subtle shift. A producer told Frank that Michael had started carrying a notebook, filling it with strange, unreadable figures. On one page, there was only a single line written in purple ink. He was a mess, but it made sense. For a second, I wished I was a mess too. Basquiat, on the other hand, hid nothing. In some paintings from 1985-1986, people could glimpse symbols echoing Michael's world: a white glove, a pair of hovering heeled shoes, and, most strikingly, the image of a cracking mask. A fan once asked if those details had anything to do with Michael Jackson. Basquiat simply smiled and, as the story goes, said, "Let's just say I met a king who didn't know he was bleeding." They did not go any further. Whatever relationship there may have been did not last. Basquiat continued to plunge into his chaotic life, while Michael returned to tours, new albums, and the inescapable whirlwind of fame. But in that short span of time, two souls that seemed impossible to intersect still managed to leave a scratch on one another, light enough not to tear things apart, yet deep enough never to fully heal. In a closed-door meeting about ideas for the Bad album, Frank recalls a member of the creative team saying that Michael had once suggested using street art as a stage backdrop. One of the early stage design sketches featured graffiti and twisted characters strongly reminiscent of Basquiat's style. Although this concept was ultimately never used, many believe Jean-Michel's imprint slipped into Michael's creative subconscious more than once. After Basquiat passed away, Michael said nothing. No written tributes, no interviews, no public memorials. But on a rare occasion, when speaking about visual art, he was said to have whispered to a critic backstage at an exhibition, "Some people paint pain so loud, it makes you feel your own more quietly." No one is certain whom those words were about, but those who had once seen them standing side by side, even just once, understood. It was not quite a relationship, not quite a friendship, not quite love. It was a collision between two deeply wounded souls, unable to heal each other, but at least having seen each other more clearly than anyone else. For Michael, Jean-Michel may have been a strange light in a dark room, as an old member of his creative team once told Frank. And that light, even if it only flashed for a few nights, was enough to make someone who spent his entire life under stage lights realize there is another kind of light, one that does not come from the stage, but from the shared sorrow of those who are truly different. Frank Cascio told me that at first, nobody thought they had anything in common. One was the king of pop, the other an icon of the British pop wave. One lived a suffocatingly private life, so hidden that it was hard to tell truth from illusion, while the other later became a symbol of courage for openly embracing his true self in a world that was not ready. Yet between them, there was still a shared point, not only the loneliness that comes with fame, but also a very quiet space in the heart, a place no one but them could reach. George Michael once said on a rare occasion, "Fame gives you everything, except love." Frank said that if you had ever seen Michael Jackson quietly step into a room with no audience, that sentence would feel like his own private truth. Both of them were lonely giants of pop, handsome, talented, worshipped by the world, but also men whose immense stardom never really allowed them to have an ordinary life, to love someone fully and peacefully. From the 1980s onward, according to Frank, whispers began to circulate backstage about an emotional connection between Michael and George. Not loud, not dramatic, but persistent, like an undercurrent. They had almost no official musical collaborations, apart from a few invitations and projects that were mentioned and then drifted away. But what drew people's attention was the way they spoke about each other, cautious, full of implication. In a 1991 interview, when asked about George Michael, Michael Jackson only gave a very slight smile and said, "He has a wonderful voice, very sensitive." It was a short line, but for those who understood Michael, Frank emphasized that was the kind of praise he reserved for people who reached the deepest parts of his soul. Once, according to a veteran London DJ whom Frank later spoke with, George Michael was invited to Neverland, not just once. Michael invited George at a time when both of them had strangely and similarly pulled back from the spotlight. No one knew what they talked about, but I remember George looked very moved after that visit. There were no photos, no tweets, no official articles, but the stories continued to circulate within the industry, fragmentary yet quietly weaving themselves into a hazy picture. A producer close to George told Frank that one evening backstage after a 25 Live tour show, George had a drink and blurted out. Michael understood silence more than anyone else. He did not elaborate, but his eyes at that moment, as the story goes, were like he had just opened a door that had been locked for far too long. George Michael did not fully open up about who he was until the late 1990s, when the world was still far from accepting. And Michael Jackson, although he faced countless rumors throughout his career, never confirmed anything about his private life. If something ever existed between them, Frank said, then it was a feeling that could only survive in unnamed silences. After George Michael passed away in 2016, a longtime member of his production team shared with Frank. They had a private understanding, like two lonely giants of pop. It was a statement that needed no verification, no evidence, because sometimes the deepest bonds are the truest when they are left undisturbed in silence. Michael Jackson, who spent his entire life bearing prejudice about his skin color, his identity, and the things people called eccentric, never really escaped the shadow the world cast on him. George Michael, who endured unfair treatment simply for daring to live honestly, understood that feeling very well. They came from two different cultures, two different continents, yet stood on the same front line. People who lived through music, but always had to live in silence. A former dancer in George's troupe once joked, in a way Frank still remembers clearly. George and Michael might never have kissed in front of cameras, but I believe they once sat together in a room, listening to Careless Whisper and staying quiet for a very, very long time. No one knows if that really happened, but the image of two men sitting in a Neverland sunset, saying nothing, just listening, is beautiful enough to make people want to believe. There is an anecdote passed around among George Michael's most loyal fans that during a trip to Los Angeles, George left an unfinished demo at a friend's house. The track was tentatively titled Echoes. The melody was low and sad, like a thin layer of cloud, and the lyrics whispered as though speaking to someone who was no longer there. The recording was never released, but those who heard it said it was a farewell to someone special George never named. If the affection between them truly existed, Frank concluded, it was not a loud, tumultuous romance. It was the kind of feeling that does not demand to be named, does not need to be proven, does not require a label. It existed like a gentle breeze crossing the grand musical landscapes they once created. Perhaps it was just a glance, a hand on the shoulder backstage, a message never sent. But for people who had spent their whole lives looked at with suspicion, simply having someone who understood them was enough. Michael Jackson and George Michael, two icons, two unfinished stories. A relationship never confirmed, but never really denied either. A feeling that, if it ever lived, might have existed in only a few brief moments, yet stayed with them until every applause had faded. And perhaps that is the most accurate definition of a private affection. Not something to hide, but something no one needs to ask about. Because the heart, whether it belongs to a celebrity or an ordinary person, only beats in one way, quietly but undeniably. Frank Cascio told me, not every relationship needs a name. There are bonds so deep that any label feels crude. Not exactly love, and not merely friendship, between Michael Jackson and Luther Vandross. According to the scattered stories Frank has gathered in the industry, there existed such a connection, a kind of soulmate that cannot be defined, does not need to be announced, quietly present, yet powerful enough to change the people involved. Luther Vandross was not the type of artist constantly entangled in personal scandals. Although he was one of the most prominent soul voices of the 1980s, he always avoided questions about his private feelings. Some people in the business whom Frank spoke with said it was the prudence of a black man in a predominantly white entertainment industry, where your success, no matter how great, could be shattered by a single label placed in the wrong spot. Others believed it was simply his discreet, reserved nature, always afraid of being misunderstood. Michael and Luther first met backstage at a major event in New York in 1983. According to a music director who was there that night, whose account Frank relayed, they did not say much, just shook hands for a long time and looked at each other as if they had already met in another lifetime. After that evening, the two names began appearing together more often at private functions, gatherings without paparazzi, uncredited studio sessions, late-night recording in some Manhattan penthouse. An anonymous studio employee who had taken part in many closed auditions for Michael's projects told Frank, Luther was different when he was around Michael. Normally, he was guarded, extremely careful. But with Mike, he loosened up. He let go. They could sit for hours without saying anything. It wasn't silence, it was comfort. Between them, there were no fiery displays or obviously intimate gestures. Everything was only glances, a light touch on the shoulder, a soft burst of laughter in the night. But according to the whispers in the industry that Frank heard, Michael once said to an assistant during a private conversation, "He makes me feel quiet inside. I don't get that with anyone else." People say it was one of the rare times Michael used the word peace to describe his feelings. Amid long tours, panic episodes from pressure, and thousands of camera flashes every time he stepped out of a car, Luther was one of the very few people who could make Michael dim the lights within himself. No judgment, no probing questions, just sitting next to him and singing. On some nights, according to a former bodyguard of Michael's whose story Frank repeated, the two would sit at the piano in the Enzino house, singing unnamed ballads to each other. Once Michael whispered, "Don't record, just remember." In an unofficial biography published in 2006, the author wrote, Michael used to call Luther his moon at his back. The presence that does not shine brighter than you, but makes your light softer. Although there was never any official confirmation, that phrase spread quickly throughout both fan communities, like a shared memory nobody could prove, but everyone wanted to believe was true. However, that relationship was not without cracks. The differences in how they existed gradually pushed both of them into a state of unspoken distance. Luther, with his tendency to stay away from public noise, felt uneasy about the increasingly obvious signs of Michael leaving reality. From Neverland to Strange Habits, from near surreal artistic decisions to his drifting away from old relationships. A longtime friend of Luther once said, according to Frank, he didn't know how to be close to someone who was never really present. Once, when asked about his relationship with Michael, Luther just smiled. We shared some silence. It meant a lot. That's all. No one knows exactly why they stopped seeing each other regularly. It may have been schedules, changes in their personal lives, or simply because the quiet they once found in each other was no longer intact. But even after they drifted apart, in a few rare television appearances, Michael still chose Luther Vandross songs as background music. And when Luther passed away, in a private notebook later put up for auction, a line handwritten in blue ink was found. "You taught me stillness. I never learned how to keep it." No one dares to be certain who Michael wrote that line for, but those close to him understood implicitly. It was a farewell to a connection that had once been one of the few sanctuaries in his stormy life. Perhaps, if it had not been an era so full of prejudice, if both had not been forced to live behind masks just to survive in a harsh industry, who knows? We might have heard them officially duet, seen them walk together in the light instead of only in the backstage shadows. But sometimes a soulmate is not the person who stays forever. It is the one who once passed through your life and made your heart feel at peace, even if only once, even if only in a wordless song, on a night without a moon. For Michael and Luther, Frank concludes, perhaps that was enough, and also all they were ever allowed to have. From what Frank Cascio shared with me, even in the most dazzling spotlights Michael stood in, there were dark corners that only he and a very small circle ever understood. In Frank's eyes, 6 names, 6 relationships, whether mere rumors, fleeting moments, or deep unspoken connections, together sketch an emotional portrait of a Michael Jackson the public never truly saw. Fragile, genuine, and aching to be understood. Amidst the glamour, success, and isolating machinery of fame, Frank is convinced that the one thing Michael Jackson truly sought was never a throne, but simply someone who could sit beside him in silence and understand. What Frank told me, and what this narrative aims to do, is not to confirm or deny anything. It is an invitation, a way of looking at these stars not just with curious eyes, but with a measure of empathy. Because in the end, as Frank quietly reminded me, they too were human beings searching for a small fragment of peace. If these untold recollections from Frank resonate with you, please like, comment, and subscribe. Let us continue exploring the quiet, yet profoundly authentic hidden facets that linger behind these immortal legends.